Hey everybody, this is writing micro lesson number 1 on crafting the thesis statement. I'm Rob Glover, and this is for Honors 111 and the Civilization sequence of the Honors College at the University of Maine. So we're going to talk about the thesis statement in just a moment, but before I do so, I want to just talk a little bit about this series of assignments that you're going to be doing and the kind of philosophy and approach to writing education that this flows from, where this idea came from, and why we're doing all of this. So this is actually inspired by the work of a guy named Atul Gawande. Atul Gawande is a cancer surgeon, he's a writer, he's a public health researcher, and he wrote this book called the Checklist Manifesto that you see on your left-hand side, and that's Atul Gawande on the right. So this book came out a few years ago. It's motivated by Atul Gawande's work in the area of reducing medical error. So he is a cancer surgeon. He was looking at the field of medicine and was kind of alarmed by, when you look at complications during surgical procedures or patient death, the number of preventable mistakes that had led to those real, personal tragedies. If somebody dies in a surgery as a result of someone's mistake, that's a tragedy. And it was motivated by his idea that this could be reduced, right? That there don't need to be so many mistakes. There don't need to be so many people that die as a result of error. So he started to look at other fields. He started to look at, for instance, the airline industry. He looked at structural engineering, when people are building skyscrapers or bridges, and how they go about their work. And what he saw was that complex tasks were broken up into manageable pieces and systematized, right? Where you create a system by which you do something, and then kind of broken down into checklists. And the team of people working on a project would work through the checklist together, which wasn't always the way that it was done in medicine. So he tried to bring some of those ideas, some of that breaking things up into its parts, breaking up complex processes into its parts, and creating checklists that people needed to run through as a group into the field of medicine, and saw really remarkable results in terms of reducing errors, reducing mistakes, and improving patients' lives. Fewer people subject to medical errors, fewer people dying during surgery. So it was a pretty remarkable insight. But the Checklist Manifesto is not just about medicine. It's really an argument that any complex process, you can do this. You can kind of break it up into its parts, create a checklist, and work through those components. And as a result, you'll be more consistent, and the overall results will be better. And so there's all sorts of examples of workplaces incorporating elements of the Checklist Manifesto. I heard an interview with Atul Gawande in which he said he even got an email from the songwriter for Weezer, the band Weezer, which you guys may or may not know. But he wrote to him and said that he read this and actually developed the Checklist Manifesto, incorporated that into his songwriting process. And so I'm trying to kind of bring in this approach to writing, right? So that's when you have these different assignments focused on different aspects of the writing process, that's what we're trying to do here. So the goal of this then is to develop and utilize some basic skills and practices that will make you all, I hope, better writers, and be more systematic in how you approach writing. How do you think about the various things that need to happen when you're writing an essay, or writing a response paper, writing a research paper. Try to get you to think in those systematic terms, and then at the end of these little micro lessons, you'll have a checklist for how to think about your approach to specifically argumentative and analytical writing, which is the type of writing that we do in this class. But I think some of these insights carry over into all forms of writing. If it's an email, or you're writing a creative story, I think some of the things that you'll learn here will help you. So that's the goal, and that's what these lessons are going to focus on, is really small micro level parts of the writing process, and then at the end of the semester we put it all together. So today we're focusing on the thesis statement, which for me is really, really important. It's what I really try to focus on, especially in these earlier kind of foundational classes, is learning how to craft a thesis statement and learning what makes a good thesis statement. And I use this metaphor a lot for thinking about the thesis statement, which is that of driving in a vehicle, right? So just imagine that you are walking down College Ave and your friend pulls up in their car, and you know this person, they're not a stranger, and they say, hey, get in the car. And you know them, so you get in the car. And what would be the first question that you would ask? Where are we going, right? The thesis statement is similar. The thesis statement is the identification of an intellectual destination to which you're going to lead your reader, all right? And if you got in that car, back to our hypothetical situation, and your friend didn't tell you where you were going, at best, you would probably be annoyed. At worst, you'd start to get a little concerned, right? If you're in a vehicle and somebody's driving you someplace, you don't know where you're going. If you're like, hey, I got work later. No, really, when are we going to be back? Can I call someone right now, right? You'd be a little freaked out, maybe. So a thesis statement operates in a similar way, that if you're reading a piece of writing and the writer doesn't tell you where they're going, in most cases, you'll just stop reading. You'll feel as if the piece of writing is directionless, and it won't be clear what exactly you're supposed to get out of it. And so, you're asking a reader to commit their time and commit their intellectual energy. They deserve to know where you're taking them. It's your responsibility as a writer to provide them with that destination. So, what is the thesis statement then? In analytical and argumentative writing, a thesis statement is just a statement. It typically appears at the close of the introductory paragraph. So the introductory paragraph is meant to kind of hook your reader, draw them in, provide some, description, some context of the topic that you're writing about. And then at the close of that introductory paragraph, this is what I intend to argue. This is what I intend to demonstrate. So it's the main point or argument of the essay. And you're then going to spend the body of the essay clarifying the point, the argument, and supporting it with evidence drawn from somewhere, right? So that's what the thesis statement is. It does a couple really important things. For your reader, as I said, it informs them of the intellectual destination. It lets them know where they're going. For you, it keeps you on track. It's almost like your GPS or your Google Maps, right? It is easy, particularly for longer papers in which you're dealing with complex material, to wander and to end up at the end of that paper in a different place from where you started. And so the thesis statement is keeping you on track in terms of getting to that eventual destination. That's really important. It's really important that if you start in one place with a certain intention, you don't end in a different place with a different intention altogether. So the thesis statement is important. There's some core components of a good thesis statement. The first is that it is concise and specific. So this will depend on the scope of what you're writing. If you're writing a 30-page research paper, it doesn't have to be as concise as if you're writing a one-page reaction paper, in which you really, really have to be very concise and very specific. But you should always hone the thesis statement in relation to the scope of what it is that you're writing. For a 5 to 7 page paper, you have to think about, what can I argue in a 5 to 7 page paper that will fit within the scope of this? And some of it varies on writing style too. Some people are very concise and to the point and can argue something pretty complex and sweeping in a smaller space, and others have a different writing style, and so they need to hone what they're going to argue on the basis of that more expansive style. So it should be concise, it should be specific. It should also be arguable. If you look at your thesis statement, you need to imagine that there would be somebody who would be unconvinced by it, right? So if you develop it and it seems as if it's a truism, it seems as if you could never actually have an argument or a disagreement about what you have there on the page, then the thesis statement is probably too vague and too broad, or you're just arguing something that's taken as general truth, and maybe you need to come up with something a little bit more meaty, a little bit more controversial that actually needs demonstration, needs arguing. And lastly, it's defensible utilizing some form of evidence. Now, the form of evidence is always going to vary based on what you're writing. So, if you're writing a paper in the social sciences, it might be, some form of data that you have, right? If you're writing a paper in the natural sciences, it might be your lab results. If you're writing a paper for a literary analysis class, then you're digging into the text and you're making some argument about what the author intended or what the literature is supposed to represent. But your thesis statement has to be tied in some way to evidence. And really the bulk of your paper is demonstrating and defending that thesis statement using that evidence. Okay, so let's look at a couple hypothetical thesis statements that you could write in this course. These both relate to a text that we read very shortly called Inanna. And we'll just kind of read them and then talk about how one is a little bit weaker and one is a little bit stronger. So the first thesis statement says, the text Inanna tells us much about ancient Sumerian culture. The second thesis statement says, the text Inanna is a powerful example of how an agricultural society weaves this condition into its founding myth. So one of those I've labeled as weaker and one of those I've labeled as stronger. And if you think about the criteria that we just laid out, maybe you have a sense of why the weaker thesis statement is weaker, the stronger thesis statement is stronger. The first thesis statement, in terms of the criteria we laid out, it doesn't really provide you with a very clear destination. Okay, so if we go back to these criteria, concise and specific, arguable, defensible, utilizing some form of evidence. Concise and specific, I don't know what specifically this is for. I don't know what the scope of what this author is writing. Okay, if they're writing a short paper, this is way too big. It's way too big to try to defend and demonstrate that claim in a short paper. This could be the core motivating kind of thesis statement for a multi-volume work that somebody would work on for the rest of their life, because it's so huge, right? So it will need to be more specific and it will need to be more concise if it's to be useful for the reader and if it's to be useful for the writer, so that they know how to approach the paper. Is it arguable? Well, I don't know, not really, right? The first statement there, it's so big and so broad, you can't imagine there being much disagreement about it. It's like if you said, patriotism is important in the United States. That's a huge claim, and people might not have very much debate over that claim because it's so enormous that there's not a lot of room for disagreement, that it's so big. So it would need to be more focused. And in terms of defensible through evidence, well, yes, technically it is defensible through evidence, but the statement is actually not giving you any guidance about what types of evidence. It's a claim about ancient Sumerian culture as a whole. So arguably the entirety of Inanna and the entirety of ancient Sumerian culture is what this writer would have to dig into in order to defend this claim, and what the reader would have to be prepared for as a reader. So it kind of strikes out on a number of different levels. If we look at that second thesis statement, much more focused, much more tightly constrained. And it does so in clear language that the reader knows exactly what to expect. So they're focusing in on the fact that ancient Sumerian culture was an agricultural society. It was an agricultural culture, and it has woven this into its founding myth. So in Inanna, there is actually a story of founding, similar to our story of founding, the Christian story of founding, right? So that, in terms of the reader's expectations about where it's going, in terms of the scope, constraining the scope of the paper and giving guidance both for the writer as to what sort of evidence to include and the reader for what sort of evidence to expect, it does a lot more. And it does a lot more without a ton of extra words, right? It's not that it takes up half a page and requires all sorts of punctuation. It's pretty tight. It's pretty concise in terms of its phrasing, but it conveys a lot more information about what to expect. So this is something, it's a skill that's important to kind of hone and master, because I think a lot of lesser quality writing that's kind of wanders or it's vague, a lot of times that is not because the student doesn't understand the material. It's not because the student hasn't done their research. It's because they start off with a thesis statement that isn't focused enough, and then every subsequent stage of the writing suffers as a result. So the more that you can hone this skill and be really good at kind of identifying a good thesis statement, the more you set yourself up for success further on down the road as you begin to write up the paper itself. So really important skill. I look forward to your papers this week in which you'll be putting it into practice, and I'll really be zeroing in on the thesis statement and how to craft quality thesis statements. Thanks very much.